One of the bugaboos that I come back a lot to on this vlog is the artificiality of a lot of mental health diagnosis. For the majority of people who walk through my door, the problem isn't really a kind of yes or no thing. It isn't in much of medicine either, but it really isn't in mental health. It's not like mumps, where you pretty much either have it or you don't. Right? Most mental health issues are dimensional. They fall on a continuum from, hey, not much at all, to, whoa, a whole lot. And we draw a pretty arbitrary line in the sand and say, let's pretend that beyond this line is a disorder and below this line is normality. But then these somewhat artificial distinctions become very real in people's minds, both the public and in providers' minds. And the dividing line begins to seem really important. Are they an inch above the line or an inch below it? We forget the line itself isn't really all that significant. Almost nowhere in mental health is this more obvious than in social anxiety disorder. If I ask you, do you have social anxiety? I know the answer before you even open your mouth. Of course you do. It's like saying, do you have height? Of course you do. If you're like me, you don't have a lot of it, but you do have some. So let's not worry too much about that dividing line. If your social anxiety bugs you or gets in the way of the life that you want to lead, it can be worth working on. If it doesn't, there's no need. It's like if you live in Ireland, you never travel, and you're scared of snakes, whatever. It doesn't matter. There aren't any snakes. But it is a line, and some people are really far along it, so that almost no matter what kind of life they want, it gets in the way. And then it can be worth working on, because the nice thing about it is that social anxiety is changeable and treatable. Like most things, the treatment isn't necessarily easy, but it does seem to be effective. Let's go back a minute though and ask, what are we talking about? What are the symptoms that we use to figure out where on that line a person is? Well, first, the person has intense fear or anxiety about one or more social situations. In most cases, it's more than one. About the most common fear or phobia of them all is a fear of public speaking, which is a form of social anxiety, and sometimes that's it. Nothing else is so scary, just public speaking. Fine, that's a very focused type. But most people with social anxiety can identify other situations that also bother them. Now, usually people have a few other friends or relatives that they're okay with. It's strangers, people they don't know too well, that provoke the fear. Meeting people, mingling, introducing yourself, asking for help, being assertive, that kind of thing. And here's the deal. It's not really a fear of other people. It's a fear of what other people will think of them. There's a thing called the invisibility test. Okay, so you're terrified of parties. Great. Tell you what, we will make you completely invisible. Guaranteed. No one can detect you at all. And then we're going to plunk you right in the middle of that party. How would you be? Well, most people with social anxiety disorder say, no problem. It's not being around other people. It's being seen and judged by them that's the issue. Okay, next symptom. One of the biggest fears is that others will see your signs of anxiety. They'll notice you stammering, or your hands shaking, or sweating, or something. They'll know that you're anxious, and then they'll judge you for that. And the social situations that we're talking about are either avoided or the person endures them, but only with intense fear. So maybe their job forces them to speak at team meetings, so they do, but they're always terrified when they do. And then two obvious points that are pretty much assumed. First, the stress is pretty reliable. It's not just now and then. It pretty much always leads to the anxiety, these social situations. Second, the anxiety is way out of proportion to the actual threat. Nobody's going to kill you. Your whole future does not depend on how great you are at this party. But it feels like it does. When I've been talking about anxiety disorders on this vlog, I've made a point of saying that the vast majority of them have two primary aspects: anxiety and avoidance. Anxiety is the emotional component, and for most people, that's the critical element, at least to them. That feeling really attracts their focus and they want to get rid of it. But the more they focus on managing the anxiety, the worse the problem tends to get. The avoidance is a way of coping with the anxiety. I freak out in crowds, so I don't go to crowded places. I feel uncomfortable in parties, so I don't go to parties. I don't like public speaking, so I never do it. And the avoidance actually works pretty well. If I can weasel out of speaking at my best friend's wedding, I feel better. Problem solved. Except that the more I avoid, the more I resultingly convince myself that if I hadn't avoided, there would have been some kind of disaster. So the thought of public speaking or being around strangers gets scarier and scarier and scarier. As well, the moment I avoid, I'm likely to have this huge surge of relief, which is a great feeling. Oh, thank God, I don't have to do that. That's a reward. And if you pair a behavior, like avoidance, with a reward, like relief, over and over and over again, the desire to avoid will get stronger and stronger and harder to resist. So people think the biggest problem is the anxiety. So it makes sense to work there. Lots of relaxation exercises and positive affirmations and finding your safe space and maybe taking anti-anxiety medication. But these can just be new ways of avoiding that nasty feeling. New kinds of avoidance. The real critical element is almost always the avoidance itself. So that's where we want to focus, even though the avoidance feels like your friend. It's what makes us feel better. And we want to feel better. But most treatment is about learning how to give that up bit by bit. Now that makes it sound like, great, you won't be avoiding stuff, you'll do that speech at your best friend's wedding, you'll speak up at work meetings, you'll hang out at parties, but you'll be hugely anxious and miserable the whole time. You'll have a terrible life. Wonderful. Well, not so. The more we can overcome the avoidance, the lower the anxiety goes. The avoidance is what's causing a lot of the anxiety. If we stop avoiding, we do get more anxious in the short term, but less anxious in the long run. The fourth party is less anxiety provoking than the first party. And this seems to be a general principle with most anxiety-related problems. The way past your anxiety is to move toward it, which, let's face it, doesn't make any sense at all, but it seems to be true anyway. In social anxiety, this kind of work usually takes two forms. First, we look at the thinking behind the problem. What would happen if you were actually at the party, or if you spoke up at that meeting? The anxiety is based in part on a prediction that something terrible will happen. It's activating the stress response, which is really an evolutionary adaptation that's designed to save your life. So, is your life in danger? Really? The very fact that someone sees their anxiety as a problem proves something. Even they don't think the danger is that great. They know the fear is based on some kind of misperception. Think of it. Imagine someone saying, yeah, I was downtown and this guy puts this gun in my face and I got really anxious. What's the matter with me? Why was I so anxious? Nobody asks that. We know why you're anxious. That's a normal reaction to having a gun in your face. So the fact that you think your anxiety is abnormal means that you already know that there's something funny about the way that you're seeing the situation. So in therapy, we'll usually do a lot of work to unpack what's going on in your head as you think about this party. The second major component, and really it's the more important one, is reducing the avoidance. We identify all these different things that you're afraid of, and then you pick out the ones that you want to work on, and we do it at a gradual level that doesn't freak you out. You do some easy stuff that you've, well, still been avoiding, and by doing that, the slightly harder stuff gets a bit easier, even though you haven't tried it yet. And by gently moving toward the things that bother you, they get less frightening. Now, it can be a little more complicated than that. And obviously, I haven't said much about how do we actually do any of those things. I'll talk about that more in upcoming posts. But that's a brief sketch.